We know BTS is global superstars, but what happens when the stage lights dim and aprons come on? Behind the glamour lies a hidden sanctuary where these 7 icons swap microphones for spatulas. Have you ever wondered who secretly cooks heartwarming meals for their loved ones? Who is the true culinary genius behind closed doors, and whose chaotic kitchen messes are made purely out of love? Are their cooking styles a direct reflection of their deepest, unfiltered personalities? Prepare to uncover the mouth-watering, emotional secrets of the biggest boy band on the planet. Let's dive straight into the hidden side of BTS, 7 members who love cooking for their loved ones. Which member's hidden kitchen secret will shock you the most?
Number 7. RM. The god of destruction, symphony of kitchen chaos, pure, honest effort. When you hear the globally renowned name Kim Namjoon, also universally revered as RM of the legendary group BTS, you immediately and naturally picture an awe-inspiring, charismatic leader with a staggering IQ of 148, a lyrical genius who effortlessly commands sold-out stadium stages, and a profound thinker who speaks eloquently at the United Nations to inspire millions across the globe. But what actually happens when you take away the dazzling microphone, silence the deafening roar of the massive crowd, and bravely hand this intellectual giant a simple, everyday kitchen knife? Welcome to the hilariously terrifying yet profoundly and deeply heartwarming culinary world of the man affectionately and accurately dubbed the God of Destruction by his own bandmates. A legendary, well-documented title he has rightfully earned through years of accidentally breaking expensive sunglasses, tearing his own clothes on stage, completely dismantling concert props, and yes, obliterating basic kitchen utensils, making his mere physical presence in the cooking area a legitimate safety hazard that often requires intense, unbroken adult supervision from the older members. Have you ever stopped to truly imagine what it takes for someone who visibly and painfully struggles to safely chop a basic, innocent onion to willingly step into the hazardous, high-stress environment of a hot kitchen, braving sharp objects and boiling liquids simply to prepare a meal for the people he cherishes most in this world? The sheer, striking contrast between his flawless, meticulously crafted musical artistry and his utterly chaotic, practically disastrous cooking skills is precisely what makes his hidden domestic side so incredibly endearing to witness. Because for Kim Namjoon, cooking is absolutely never about achieving a perfect Michelin star presentation, plating like a seasoned professional chef, or mastering complex culinary techniques to show off, but rather a raw, unfiltered, and deeply emotional expression of love, profound vulnerability, and a desperate, beautiful desire to care for his chosen family. Let's take a deeply nostalgic journey and rewind to those grueling, poverty-stricken early dorm days in Nanyangdong, where 7 ambitious but terrified teenage boys were crammed into a tiny, suffocating space, fighting tooth and nail for their very survival in the notoriously cutthroat and unforgiving K-pop industry. And RM, feeling the immense, crushing weight of daily leadership constantly bearing down on his broad shoulders, occasionally tried to step up and enthusiastically contribute to the mundane household chores, only to inevitably end up completely burning the bottom of the communal frying pan, or creating mysterious dishes that were, to put it mildly, a highly abstract, surrealist interpretation of edible food. Do you remember the legendary internet-breaking live broadcasts where he practically waged a full-scale, sweating war against a simple, innocent garlic clove, or a stubbornly uncooperative piece of raw chicken, his face completely scrunched up in intense, furrowed concentration, as if he were trying to urgently solve a complex mathematical theorem, or decode the absolute secrets of the universe? Have you ever seen a grown man hold a standard kitchen knife like he is gripping a heavy sword in an epic historical drama, gently and awkwardly sawing at a vegetable, as if he is attempting to fell a giant oak tree in the middle of a dense forest? That is the pure, unadulterated RM cooking experience, while his members watched cautiously from the sidelines in a chaotic, unforgettable mixture of sheer terror, secondhand embarrassment, and uncontrollable floor-rolling amusement. Yet, if you look closely beneath the comedic, highly meme-worthy surface of these spectacular kitchen disasters, you will uncover a profoundly touching, tear-jerking narrative about a young man who, despite acutely knowing his glaring weaknesses and obvious physical limitations, absolutely refuses to ever give up, actively pushing through his innate clumsiness, because the act of feeding someone, of providing warm physical nourishment, is a universal, ancient language of love he desperately wants to speak fluently to his beloved brothers. Fast forward through the challenging years to their restorative, beautifully healing vacations on the reality show In the Soup, where the frenetic, exhausting pace of their superstar idol lives finally slowed down, and the members had the rare, precious freedom to just breathe and be their authentic, unpolished selves. And there was RM, armed with a newfound burning determination to make the absolute perfect aglio olio, pacing nervously around the outdoor stove with a palpable, highly visible mixture of crippling anxiety and pure childlike excitement, meticulously reading and rereading the recipe instructions on his phone, as if carefully translating an ancient sacred manuscript. The sheer, blinding joy that instantly illuminated his handsome face, bringing out those famous, deeply etched dimples when Jeon or Suga, the designated, intimidatingly skilled chefs of the group, took a hesitant bite and actually nodded in genuine, surprised approval, validating his hard-fought, slightly chaotic creation, was a monumental moment of pure, unadulterated triumph that resonated powerfully with anyone who has ever bravely stepped out of their comfort zone solely for the sake of making a loved one smile. What makes RM's incredibly unique culinary journey so deeply relatable, emotionally resonant, and utterly captivating is that he strips away the intimidating, untouchable superstar aura, revealing the deeply human, beautifully flawed side of a global icon who gets genuinely, visibly frustrated when the instant noodles boil aggressively over the pot, who legitimately panics when the hot cooking oil splatters dangerously onto his bare arms, but who ultimately plates the humble food with a proud, glowing smile that can instantly melt the absolute coldest of hearts. Can you even begin to fathom the immense, suffocating pressure he faces daily, flawlessly managing the dynamic, ever-shifting energies of the world's biggest musical group, dealing with astronomical global expectations from millions of fans, acting as the primary spokesperson in intimidating foreign countries, and constantly writing chart-topping, soul-stirring hits, only to actively seek a quiet, albeit messy and stressful solace in the simple, primal act of preparing food for his closest friends and family? His chaotic, highly unpredictable kitchen adventures serve as a beautiful, profound reminder to all of us that clinical perfection is entirely overrated, and that a slightly burnt, misshapen pancake or a hastily rolled kimbap that is bursting at the seams, when meticulously crafted with genuine intention, honest sweat, and a whole lot of unconditional love, holds infinitely more emotional value than a flawless, aesthetically pleasing but ultimately soulless gourmet meal prepared by a complete stranger. Through his spectacular, highly entertaining culinary misadventures, RM inadvertently teaches his millions of dedicated fans a powerful, life-altering lesson in profound humility and radical vulnerability, showing us that it is perfectly, undeniably okay to be hilariously bad at something, as long as you bravely pour your entire heart and soul into the effort, wholly embracing your clumsy flaws and magically transforming them into moments of shared, echoing laughter and unforgettable, deep bonding memories. behind strictly closed doors, safely tucked away from the blinding, relentless flashes of paparazzi cameras and the deafening, earth-shattering screams of crowded arenas, Kim Namjoon isn't trying to impress snooty culinary critics or win highly competitive cooking shows. He is simply a devoted, incredibly loving son who wants nothing more than to cook a warm, comforting meal for his proud parents when he rarely gets the chance to visit his childhood home. A deeply caring older brother who wants to ease the heavy daily domestic burden of the group's designated exhausted cooks, and a profoundly affectionate, fiercely loyal friend who firmly believes that sharing a hot meal, especially one you struggled intensely and hilariously to make yourself with your own two clumsy hands, is the ultimate, purest form of human intimacy.
Number 6. V, the aesthetic genius, master of illusions, plating over perfection. When you gaze deeply into the profoundly soulful, breathtakingly expressive eyes of Kim Tae-young, universally celebrated as V of the legendary group BTS, you are instantly transported into a mesmerizing world of high-end fashion, meticulously curated classic jazz playlists, and an ethereal, almost untouchable artistic aura that feels completely and utterly disconnected from the messy, greasy, and highly chaotic reality of a standard domestic kitchen, leading you to inevitably wonder, how exactly does the man widely recognized by multiple publications as the most handsome face in the entire world, a global fashion icon who literally breathes pure luxury and effortless style, actually navigate the unglamorous, sweat-inducing heat of a sizzling stove or a violently bubbling deep fryer? For the longest time in the expansive, highly documented, and deeply cherished history of BTS, Tae-young was absolutely never the member you would willingly or safely trust with a dangerously sharp chef's knife or a highly complicated multi-step recipe, proudly and openly carrying the humble, undisputed, and rather comedic title of the group's designated, highly enthusiastic dishwasher, a crucial but distinctly non-culinary role he embraced with a deeply endearing, almost childlike innocence, while the older, significantly more experienced members frantically chopped, boiled, and seasoned around him in their cramped dormitory. Do you vividly recall those legendary, side-splitting, and highly viral early episodes of their beloved variety show, Run BTS, where the mere daunting prospect of cooking a basic, everyday meal sent him into a state of visible, wide-eyed panic, famously resulting in him completely abandoning the actual fundamental cooking process to focus entirely, obsessively, and exclusively on the visual presentation, notoriously creating the highly iconic internet-breaking dish hilariously dubbed A Squirrel Trapped in a Garden, where he meticulously and delicately arranged ordinary pieces of glazed sweet potato onto a brightly colored plate as if he were sculpting a priceless avant-garde masterpiece for the Louvre Museum. Have you ever stopped to truly analyze the profound, deeply emotional psychology behind a man who genuinely and passionately believes that the visual ambiance, the exact, precise placement of a single sesame seed, and the overarching aesthetic narrative of a dish are fundamentally just as important, if not vastly more crucial, than the actual tangible physical taste of the food itself? This incredibly unique, deeply artistic, and highly unconventional approach to culinary endeavors perfectly and beautifully mirrors Tae-young's overarching, deeply poetic philosophy of life, where every single moment, no matter how mundane, routine, or ordinary, must be carefully and deliberately crafted into a cinematic, memorable experience for the people he profoundly cherishes, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that his undeniable love language isn't necessarily about executing complex Michelin-star techniques or perfectly balancing flavor profiles, but rather about creating a holistic, deeply comforting, and visually stunning atmosphere that makes his loved ones feel incredibly special, deeply valued, and visually enchanted. But then, in a shocking
shocking, brilliant, and utterly captivating twist of fate that absolutely no one in the massive global fandom saw coming. The entire world was suddenly granted an unprecedented, highly intimate, and deeply revealing front-row seat to one of the most spectacular, heartwarming character developments in modern entertainment history, when this self-proclaimed kitchen novice courageously packed his bags and flew all the way to a picturesque, sun-drenched, idyllic town in Bacalar, Mexico, to star in the hit reality show Ginny's Kitchen, completely stripping away his blinding superstar status, leaving behind the deafening roar of sold-out stadiums to become a humble, overworked, and highly stressed restaurant intern. Can you even begin to fathom the sheer, unadulterated dedication and profound humility it takes for a globally worshipped idol accustomed to millions of adoring fans chanting his name to willingly submit himself to the grueling, physically demanding, and relentlessly fast-paced reality of a commercial kitchen, spending exhausting, back-breaking hours meticulously washing endless mountains of dirty, grease-stained dishes, violently battling the intimidating, dangerously splashing hot oil to perfectly fry Korean corn dogs, and painstakingly, meticulously preparing highly intricate vegetable ingredients long before the morning sun even fully rises over the horizon. Watching Taeyoung slowly but surely evolve from a hesitant, clumsy beginner who stared blankly and confusedly at a simple, written recipe into a deeply focused, fiercely determined sous-chef who proudly and confidently served his beautifully crafted, piping hot creations to completely oblivious, highly satisfied international customers was a profoundly moving, tear-jerking revelation, showcasing a hidden, intensely gritty work ethic and a desperate desire to prove his worth that beautifully and sharply contrasted his soft, luxurious, and seemingly untouchable exterior. Yet even amidst the incredibly chaotic, high-pressure, and fiercely demanding environment of a bustling restaurant kitchen, his signature, undeniable eccentricity and artistic flair brightly and continuously shined through, whether he was randomly and hilariously donning a futuristic, fully transparent face shield to bravely protect his million-dollar visuals from the aggressively stinging fumes of chopped onions, or silently, intensely grooving to a classic vinyl jazz record playing in the background, while meticulously pouring the exact, mathematically perfect ratio of pancake batter, effortlessly transforming the simple, highly mundane act of cooking into a captivating, deeply emotional, and highly entertaining performance art. When Taeyoung cooks for his beloved, exhausted members, his deeply respected and beloved family back in Daegu, or his fiercely adored, tight-knit circle of celebrity friends, he completely and deliberately bypasses the traditional, strict, and often suffocating norms of culinary perfection, opting instead to pour his entire complex and beautiful soul into the deeply personal, highly specific, and visually pleasing details that others might carelessly overlook or dismiss as unnecessary. Remember the deeply touching, beautifully quiet moments during their profoundly healing In the Soup reality vacations, when he bravely took it upon himself to quietly, lovingly prepare fresh, cold, and incredibly sweet strawberry juice, or carefully slice refreshing watermelon for his deeply exhausted older brothers, carefully and meticulously washing each individual piece of fruit and blending them with a quiet, concentrated, and almost prayer-like devotion that spoke absolute deafening volumes about his profound, unspoken affection and deep-rooted gratitude for the resilient group that basically raised him from a naive teenager into a global phenomenon. He doesn't just want to simply fill their empty, rumbling stomachs with basic calories. He desperately and passionately wants to feed their exhausted, weary souls, carefully curating a beautiful, comforting visual and auditory experience that temporarily but effectively shields them from the immense, crushing, and often terrifying weight of their unprecedented global fame, proving that sometimes the most profoundly delicious and deeply unforgettable ingredient a person can possibly add to a simple, home-cooked meal is a heavy, generous dash of pure, unfiltered artistic passion and a deeply genuine, burning desire to create a fleeting, beautiful, and highly photographable memory.
Number 5. Jimin, the angel of comfort, midnight ramen specialist, serving pure warmth in a bowl. When you think of Park Jimin, universally celebrated as the mesmerizing lead vocalist and phenomenally gifted main dancer of BTS, your mind instantly and naturally conjures breathtaking images of his gravity-defying contemporary dance moves, his astonishingly powerful high notes that seemingly pierce through the very heavens, and his captivating, almost otherworldly stage presence that effortlessly commands the absolute attention of millions of devoted fans across the globe. But what truly happens when the blinding stadium spotlights are finally turned off? The deafening screams of the massive crowds fade into a gentle silence, and this deeply empathetic, intensely caring soul retreats into the quiet, intimate sanctuary of the group's private dormitory. To truly understand Jimin's incredibly touching, profoundly emotional, and deeply nurturing relationship with the culinary arts, you must first completely discard the traditional, highly restrictive notion of a formally trained, technically flawless chef, and instead fully embrace the beautiful, heartwarming concept of a culinary guardian angel whose absolute primary ingredient is always unadulterated, pure, and unconditional love. Have you ever closely observed the immense, overwhelming wave of pure tenderness that instantly floods his beautiful, expressive eyes when one of his beloved bandmates casually mentions feeling even slightly hungry after a grueling, bone-crushing 12-hour dance practice, prompting him to immediately spring into action like a highly trained domestic superhero? Jimin has never boldly claimed to be a master of complex haute cuisine or a pioneer of revolutionary gourmet techniques, but he holds a deeply revered, entirely undisputed title within the incredibly tight-knit BTS family as the undisputed, absolute king of the late-night, deeply comforting and soul-healing midnight snack, specifically his universally legendary, meticulously crafted bowls of steaming hot ramen that have single-handedly saved the exhausted, weary souls of his 6 chosen brothers on countless highly stressful nights. Can you even begin to fathom the profound, deeply touching level of pure selflessness it takes for a globally worshipped megastar whose own physical body is aching and screaming for desperately needed rest after performing flawlessly for a massive sold-out stadium to winningly and happily drag his exhausted limbs into a brightly lit kitchen at 2 in the morning, meticulously boiling the water to the exact mathematically perfect temperature, carefully adding the precise ratio of savory seasoning and lovingly dropping in the perfect, flawlessly cooked egg, all just to bring a fleeting, precious moment of pure, unadulterated joy to a younger brother like Jungkook or a highly stressed leader like RM. This beautifully simple, seemingly mundane act of boiling noodles is, for Park Jimin, absolutely never just about providing basic, essential physical calories. It is a profound, deeply emotional, and highly intimate ritual of offering profound emotional solace, a warm, edible, and incredibly delicious hug, meticulously designed to magically melt away the crushing, suffocating anxieties of their unprecedented, sky-high global fame. Let us take a deeply emotional, profoundly reflective journey back to their highly challenging, deeply uncertain early debut days, a grueling period where the 7 young men were constantly battling intense physical exhaustion, crippling self-doubt, and the terrifying, ever-present fear of absolute failure in the highly competitive, brutally unforgiving K-pop industry. A time when Jimin himself notoriously and heartbreakingly struggled with immense crushing pressure and intense dietary restrictions, making his deeply beautiful evolution into a man who now actively, happily, and freely finds profound joy in nourishing himself and his loved ones, one of the most incredibly inspiring, tear-jerking narratives in the entire expansive lore of BTS.
Do you vividly remember those incredibly heartwarming, highly chaotic, and absolutely hilarious episodes of Run BTS, where Jimin, despite occasionally mixing up basic ingredients, struggling to flip a simple pancake, or accidentally spilling a bit of hot soup on the counter, always approached every single cooking challenge with an infectious, blindingly bright smile, a deeply charming, highly endearing sense of playful enthusiasm, and a desperate, beautiful desire to make sure absolutely everyone around him felt completely included, deeply valued, and well-fed? Have you ever witnessed the sheer, unadulterated panic completely overtake his usually calm, collected demeanor when he accidentally cuts a vegetable slightly too thick or accidentally drops a piece of precious pork cutlet, immediately looking around with his signature deeply endearing eye smile, practically begging for reassuring validation from his older, more experienced brothers like Jin or Suga, proving that even in his highly earnest, deeply focused attempts to provide care, he remains the beloved, highly cherished mochi of the group who desperately thrives on mutual affection and warm praise. When Jimin cooks for his fiercely adored members, his deeply respected family back in Busan, or his tight-knit circle of fiercely loyal friends, he completely bypasses the strict, intimidating rules of Michelin star plating, choosing instead to pour his entire, incredibly vast and deeply sensitive soul into the profoundly personal, highly comforting act of active caregiving. Whether it is painstakingly and delicately rolling perfectly proportioned kimbap for a long, exhausting group road trip, meticulously preparing a rich, bubbling pot of spicy kimchi stew, or enthusiastically helping to marinate hundreds of pounds of cabbage during their legendary group kimchi-making sessions, always ensuring his beloved bandmates are reminded of the warm, comforting, and deeply nostalgic taste of their own mother's home cooking. The incredibly beautiful, highly profound irony of Jimin's culinary adventures is that the very man who once mistakenly believed he had to constantly shrink himself and brutally restrict his own nourishment to achieve an impossible, highly toxic standard of physical perfection has miraculously and beautifully transformed into the group's most dedicated, highly observant, and intensely passionate food fairy, constantly lovingly nagging his brothers to eat more, secretly sneaking them extra highly coveted portions of premium beef during group dinners, and fiercely ensuring that absolutely no one in his precious, chosen family ever goes to bed with an empty stomach or a heavy, burdened heart. Behind the fiercely mesmerizing gaze, the incredibly sharp, jaw-dropping choreography, and the phenomenally angelic voice that has profoundly comforted millions of deeply struggling souls across the globe, Park Jimin is ultimately a deeply grounded, incredibly nurturing, and profoundly affectionate young man from Busan, who firmly and passionately believes that the ultimate, purest, and most authentic expression of human love is quite simply making sure the people you cherish are warm, safe, and deeply, entirely satisfied. His incredibly heartwarming, deeply emotional, and profoundly inspiring kitchen endeavors vividly and powerfully teach all of us an absolutely crucial, life-altering lesson in empathy. You absolutely do not need to possess incredible world-class culinary skills or expensive top-of-the-line kitchen equipment to profoundly change someone's entire day, and that a beautifully simple, steaming hot bowl of perfectly cooked noodles, when meticulously prepared with genuine, unfiltered intention and a whole lot of unconditional burning love, holds vastly more profound emotional weight and incredible healing power than the most expensive, critically acclaimed gourmet meal in the entire world. As we lovingly and closely observe his continuous, beautiful, naturally unfolding journey of deeply caring for others through the highly universal, profoundly intimate medium of food, we are powerfully, undeniably, and intensely reminded of the sheer transformative magic of small, deliberate, and deeply selfless acts of domestic kindness, ultimately leaving us absolutely compelled to deeply ponder one incredibly challenging, highly introspective, and profoundly moving question. If the world's most incredibly dazzling, fiercely adored global icon can willingly and happily spend his rare, precious moments of rest, painstakingly boiling a simple, humble late-night snack just to ease the heavy, invisible burdens of his beloved friends, what kind of deeply comforting, profoundly healing warmth are we actively choosing to serve to the precious, irreplaceable people in our own incredibly fleeting and beautiful lives?
Number 4. J-Hope. The meticulous sous-chef, master of pristine counters, serving sunshine and morning coffee. When you dare to envision the undeniably electric, stage-commanding presence of Young Ho-sok, universally adored and deeply respected as J-Hope of the legendary group BTS, you instantly picture a fiercely strict, highly intimidating dance captain who demands absolute perfection in every single synchronized movement, a brilliant rapper with boundless, uncontainable energy, and a blindingly radiant human sun who effortlessly illuminates even the darkest, most incredibly daunting stadium arenas across the entire globe. But what deeply fascinating, hilariously relatable chaos ensues when you abruptly drag this meticulous, rhythm-obsessed perfectionist out of the familiar mirror-lined dance studio and thrust him directly into the wildly unpredictable, fiercely bubbling, and aggressively splattering environment of a hot, heavily crowded kitchen. To truly comprehend J-Hope's incredibly unique, profoundly endearing, and heavily structured relationship with the art of cooking, one must completely look past the highly glorified center stage role of the head chef and deeply appreciate the unsung, absolutely vital and incredibly heartwarming role of the ultimate culinary caretaker, the pristine mood maker who obsessively, lovingly ensures that the communal cooking space does not instantly devolve into an apocalyptic post-disaster wasteland of dirty pans and scattered ingredients. Have you ever closely watched an internationally worshipped multi-millionaire pop icon legitimately scream in absolute high-pitched terror just because a tiny microscopic drop of hot cooking oil unexpectedly jumped out of a frying pan, or violently flinch away from a mildly sizzling sausage as if he were bravely facing down a terrifying, mythical, fire-breathing dragon in an epic high-stakes fantasy battle? This deeply hilarious, incredibly viral contrast between his untouchable, ferociously cool on-stage hip-hop persona and his easily startled, heavily cautious, and highly hygienic domestic reality is precisely what makes watching J-Hope in a kitchen such an absolute, unadulterated joy for millions of deeply amused fans worldwide. Because even when he is completely terrified of the dangerously popping grease, he absolutely refuses to abandon his beloved brothers, bravely standing by their side with a trusty kitchen towel firmly in hand, ready to wipe down a slightly messy counter at a moment's absolute notice. Let us take a deeply nostalgic, emotionally resonant journey back to the highly chaotic, relentlessly demanding early years of their unprecedented career, where 7 distinctly different, incredibly loud personalities were forced to share a cramped, heavily suffocating dormitory space, a notoriously messy environment that would have easily broken a lesser man. But J-Hope, armed with his innate, deeply ingrained sense of pristine organization and a profound, beautiful desire for harmonious living, seamlessly took it upon himself to become the group's unofficial mother of cleanliness, constantly and meticulously picking up after the others, not out of bitter resentment, but out of a deep, unconditional, and highly protective love for his chosen family. Do you vividly remember those incredibly iconic, tear-inducingly funny episodes of Run BTS where he was tasked with actually preparing a meal, his exceptionally beautiful face completely scrunched up in intense, highly nervous concentration, nervously asking the older members for constant reassurance over the most basic, fundamentally simple steps, proving that while he might not naturally possess the bold, reckless culinary confidence of Jin or the quiet, masterful expertise of Suga, his absolute willingness to dive into the terrifying, unknown world of cooking strictly to feed his teammates is a profound, deeply touching testament to his incredibly selfless character. Yet when you fast forward to their deeply healing, profoundly intimate reality shows like In the Soup, a vastly different, deeply comforting, and incredibly serene side of J-Hope's kitchen presence beautifully emerges, completely shattering the comedic illusion of the terrified amateur and revealing a remarkably thoughtful, deeply observant provider who finds absolute, pure joy in the quiet, peaceful mornings before the rest of the chaotic household fully wakes up. Can you even begin to fathom the profound, incredibly soothing emotional comfort of waking up in a remote, heavily forested cabin after a grueling, deeply exhausting year of unprecedented global scrutiny, only to gently walk into a sunlit kitchen and find the world's most famous dance leader quietly, meticulously, and lovingly preparing a perfectly toasted piece of bread, carefully spreading the jam with mathematical precision, and expertly brewing a beautifully iced Americano just the way you like it, all while humming a soft, deeply infectious melody? For young Hosak, the act of preparing food is absolutely entirely about establishing a warm, deeply safe, and heavily structured sanctuary for his heavily burdened, fiercely adored members, proving that his ultimate love language isn't necessarily about cooking a massively complicated, highly elaborate 5-course gourmet banquet, but rather about the incredibly reliable, highly consistent, and deeply comforting morning rituals that gently ground his brothers and perfectly set a positive, incredibly bright tone for their entire day. The incredibly beautiful, highly profound reality of J-Hope's domestic side is that he perfectly understands that a successful, harmonious kitchen absolutely needs someone to manage the underlying chaos, someone who happily, willingly, and fiercely takes on the highly unglamorous, often entirely overlooked tasks of immediately washing the heavily encrusted pots, meticulously organizing the heavily cluttered refrigerator, and eagerly serving as the enthusiastic, highly vocal taste tester who dramatically and loudly praises the main chef's hard work, ensuring that the cooking process remains a joyous, deeply bonding experience rather than a stressful, heavily burdensome chore. He acts as the vital, deeply irreplaceable emotional glue that holds the entire messy, highly volatile kitchen ecosystem perfectly together, seamlessly blending his innate, deeply powerful leadership skills with a soft, incredibly nurturing maternal instinct that desperately wants to see his beloved friends healthy, happy, and living in a clean, highly organized environment. Behind the incredibly blinding smiles, the millions of heavily streamed records, and the ferociously sharp, breathtaking dance breaks, J-Hope is ultimately a deeply grounded, incredibly practical, and profoundly caring man from Gwangju, who firmly believes that true, unconditional love is loudly and clearly found in the absolute pristine details, in the deliberate, highly conscious effort to make someone else's daily life just a tiny bit easier, a bit more organized, and significantly brighter through beautifully simple, highly intentional acts of domestic service. His highly entertaining, deeply moving, and profoundly inspiring culinary journey powerfully and vividly teaches all of us an absolutely essential, life-altering lesson in profound humility and teamwork.
You absolutely do not need to be the one holding the main frying pan or loudly barking the complex orders to be the absolute beating heart of the kitchen, and that quietly, consistently pouring a fresh cup of coffee and maintaining a clean, highly supportive environment for the people you deeply cherish is a profoundly beautiful, highly impactful form of love that holds vastly more emotional resonance than the most critically acclaimed, highly complicated recipe in existence. As we closely, lovingly, and deeply observe his continuous, profoundly beautiful dedication to nurturing his beloved family through these incredibly small, highly structured, and deeply supportive acts, we are intensely, undeniably reminded of the sheer transformative magic of simply being a reliable, deeply comforting presence in the heavy, chaotic life, ultimately leaving us heavily compelled to actively ask ourselves a deeply introspective, incredibly challenging, and profoundly moving question. If the world's most incredibly energetic, fiercely adored superstar can willingly and happily find deep, profound joy in the quiet, unglamorous act of wiping down a sticky counter and making a simple morning toast just to see his brother smile, how much deeply intentional, highly supportive sunshine are we actively choosing to bring into the messy, highly chaotic kitchens of our own fleeting, beautifully imperfect lives?
Number 3. Jungkook, the golden chef of the night, master of perilla oil, midnight feasts of passion. When you hear the universally recognized name Jungkook, known to millions of fiercely dedicated fans as the absolute, undisputed golden maknae of the record-breaking group BTS, you immediately picture a breathtakingly talented, multi-hyphenate prodigy who effortlessly dominates global music charts, executes violently demanding choreography with mind-bending precision, and possesses a profoundly enchanting, honey-like vocal tone that has literally captivated the entire world. But what deeply intimate, profoundly relatable magic happens when this unstoppable, stadium-conquering force of nature decides to completely forego sleep, tie his hair up, and fire up his kitchen stove at 4 in the morning? To truly and deeply comprehend Jungkook's immensely passionate, highly experimental, and absolutely mesmerizing relationship with the culinary arts, you must completely abandon the idea of cooking as a mere daily chore and fiercely embrace it as a profound, hyper-focused obsession, a deeply loving extension of his innate, unstoppable desire to absolutely master every single thing he touches for the sake of the people he unconditionally loves. Have you ever closely watched a billionaire, history-making pop star casually turn on a live broadcast in the dead of the night, wearing nothing but a comfortable, oversized t-shirt, completely barefaced, meticulously mixing a bowl of spicy perilla oil buckwheat noodles with the intense, laser-like focus of a seasoned master artisan crafting a priceless artifact? This incredibly unique, deeply intimate, and wildly viral phenomenon of Jungkook's Midnight Kitchen has single-handedly shattered the traditionally cold, highly manufactured illusion of the untouchable celebrity, offering the entire globe a profoundly comforting, intensely raw, and beautifully vulnerable front-row seat to his pure, unadulterated joy of creating something deliciously perfect from scratch. Let us take a deeply emotional, profoundly nostalgic journey back to his incredibly tender teenage years, a grueling, heavily emotional period where a deeply shy, wide-eyed boy from Busan left the warm, safe comfort of his parents' home at the astonishingly young age of 13, moving into a cramped, highly stressful Seoul dormitory where he was practically raised, nurtured, and fiercely protected by his 6 older bandmates, making his current, overwhelming desire to aggressively and lovingly feed them a profoundly moving, tear-jerking narrative of immense gratitude and deep, unspoken loyalty.
Do you vividly remember those incredibly iconic, heavily praised moments during their deeply healing In the Soup reality shows, where the youngest member effortlessly and confidently took absolute control of the outdoor cooking station, fearlessly tossing massive slabs of rich, sizzling pork belly onto a blazing hot grill, masterfully flipping the heavy meat with a practiced, awe-inspiring ease that instantly commanded the quiet, deep respect of his usually chaotic older brothers? Have you ever stopped to truly analyze the sheer, unadulterated dedication it takes for a young man who spends agonizing, bone-crushing hours perfecting his stage performances to subsequently pour that exact same terrifying level of intense mathematical precision into calculating the absolute perfect ratio of soy sauce, crushed garlic, and deeply fragrant perilla oil for his fiercely guarded, highly coveted noodle recipe, stubbornly testing and retesting it until it perfectly matched the specific, highly demanding flavor profile he aggressively envisioned in his mind? When Jung cooks for his deeply cherished members, his fiercely adored family, or even virtually for millions of watching fans across the globe, he completely bypasses the superficial, highly visual aspects of traditional plating, choosing instead to focus entirely, obsessively on the absolute, pure explosion of flavor, a deeply sensory experience that he desperately wants to share with the people who anchor his highly chaotic, unprecedented life. The incredibly beautiful, profoundly emotional reality of Jungkook's highly active culinary adventures is that he doesn't just throw ingredients into a pan, he violently, passionately researches, deeply studies, and intensely immerses himself in the absolute science of the dish. Whether he is vigorously deep-frying incredibly crispy chicken, carefully simmering a rich, heavily spiced bulgogi, or enthusiastically demonstrating his highly specific, entirely unique method of making the ultimate mind-blowing late-night ramen. Have you ever witnessed the sheer, unadulterated ecstasy that instantly takes over his entire, highly expressive face when he takes the very first, highly anticipated bite of his own successful creation, his large, deeply shining doe eyes widening in absolute pure disbelief at his own staggering culinary genius, prompting him to enthusiastically clap his hands together in a deeply endearing display of profound satisfaction? Let us deeply consider the profound significance of his highly publicized bulguri recipe, a deeply ingenious, fiercely innovative combination of two completely different instant noodle brands that he meticulously engineered, carefully adjusted, and proudly shared with the entire world, causing massive global sellouts purely because his genuine, unfiltered excitement was so incredibly infectious. When he stands confidently at the roaring grill during their highly treasured group vacations, seamlessly taking the heavy cooking tongs from his deeply respected older brothers like Jeon or Suga, he is silently but powerfully declaring his beautiful, undeniable growth from the quiet, deeply hesitant teenager who used to nervously wait for his youngs to feed him into a fiercely capable, profoundly reliable young man who desperately wants to actively shoulder the burden and provide deep, incredibly satisfying physical nourishment for the very men who essentially raised him. His cooking is absolutely never just about satisfying a late-night craving. It is a profound, beautifully loud, and incredibly intense celebration of life itself, a deeply sensory exploration of flavors that serves as a testament to his boundless, terrifyingly beautiful curiosity and his absolute, unwavering refusal to do anything in life halfway. Behind the fiercely captivating stage persona and the countless history-making global records, Jungkook's wildly passionate, deeply experimental kitchen adventures serve as an incredibly inspiring, profoundly touching reminder that the most authentic, deeply meaningful connections are often forged not under the blinding glare of stadium spotlights, but in the quiet, highly chaotic warmth of a home kitchen, constantly pushing us to ponder one incredibly deep, beautifully challenging question. If this globally adored, wildly successful golden boy can continuously find such profound, unadulterated magic and deep emotional fulfillment in the simple, highly messy act of feeding the people he loves, what breathtaking, hidden culinary masterpieces of deep, unconditional affection are we actively denying ourselves and our own loved ones by failing to bravely step up to the stove and cook with all our hearts?
Number 2. Suga, the silent chef, master of the cutting board, unspoken love on a plate. When you first encounter the intimidating, fiercely guarded, and profoundly complex musical genius that is Min Yoongi, globally worshipped by millions under the legendary monikers of Suga of BTS and the explosive, unapologetically raw solo hip-hop artist August D, your mind immediately conjures powerful, striking images of a stoic, razor-tongued rapper spitting absolute fire into a studio microphone, a relentlessly driven, wildly prolific record producer locked away for countless agonizing hours in the dimly lit sanctuary of his genius lab, and a fiercely independent, seemingly aloof superstar who famously and hilariously prefers the quiet, undisturbed peace of simply lying down perfectly still as a rock over any form of unnecessary physical exertion. But what breathtaking, profoundly moving, and deeply emotional reality unfolds when this famously quiet, heavily introverted man deliberately steps away from his highly complex mixing boards, silently walks into a bustling, chaotic kitchen, and effortlessly, masterfully wields a heavy professional chef's knife with the terrifying, awe-inspiring precision of a seasoned Michelin star veteran. To truly, deeply, and comprehensively understand Min Yoongi's incredibly fascinating, profoundly intimate, and entirely unspoken relationship with the intricate art of cooking, you must completely and utterly discard the heavily manufactured, superficial illusion of the cold, unfeeling wrapper and bravely peel back the heavily fortified layers to reveal a deeply sensitive, profoundly observant, and fiercely loyal protector whose absolute, undeniable primary love language is flawlessly executed through silent, highly practical acts of domestic service. Have you ever closely and lovingly watched this incredibly intimidating, history-making global icon casually, effortlessly dismantle a massive, intimidating slab of raw meat or meticulously mince a mountain of fresh garlic with a terrifyingly fast, rhythmic, and hypnotic chopping technique that instantly leaves his younger, significantly more chaotic bandmates staring in absolute silent, wide-eyed awe, deeply proving that his terrifyingly high level of meticulous, calculated perfectionism is absolutely never just confined strictly to his chart-topping, soul-stirring musical arrangements? Let us take a deeply emotional, profoundly reflective, and highly nostalgic journey back to the very foundation of their grueling, unprecedented career, to those suffocating, heavily uncertain early dorm days when 7 fiercely ambitious young men were constantly battling crippling anxiety, massive financial struggles, and the terrifying, ever-present specter of absolute failure. And amidst the incredibly loud, overwhelming chaos of the bustling household, Yoongi quietly, seamlessly assumed the deeply vital, entirely unglamorous role of the group's silent, fiercely reliable pillar of absolute stability, constantly taking the heavy, burdensome domestic responsibilities upon his own broad, silently aching shoulders, without ever once loudly demanding an ounce of praise or grand dramatic recognition from the younger members he was desperately trying to protect. Do you vividly and fondly remember those incredibly iconic, breathtakingly heartwarming moments heavily documented during their deeply healing, restorative, in-the-soup reality vacations, where the usually chaotic, heavily energetic members would finally retreat to relax, and Yoongi would silently, immediately, and instinctively march straight into the kitchen, firmly tying his apron and effortlessly, masterfully taking complete, undisputed command of the cooking station with the quiet, terrifyingly competent aura of an incredibly seasoned restaurant head chef who genuinely has absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone? He doesn't loudly boast, he doesn't dramatically scream in high-pitched terror when the dangerously hot oil vigorously splatters against his pale skin, and he certainly doesn't require constant needy emotional validation for his culinary efforts. He simply, quietly, and highly efficiently gets the difficult job done, seamlessly preparing incredibly complex, fiercely delicious dishes like deeply comforting gambas al ajillo, perfectly seared, mouth-wateringly juicy premium steaks, and heavily spiced, deeply savory kimchi fried rice, effectively feeding an entire massively hungry boy band with an astonishing, mind-boggling level of ease that borders on sheer, unadulterated superpower. Have you ever stopped to truly, deeply analyze the immense, profound emotional depth heavily embedded within a man who fundamentally struggles to verbally express his deep, vulnerable affections, finding it incredibly awkward to casually utter a simple declaration of love to his deeply cherished brothers, but who will unhesitatingly, fiercely, and lovingly spend hours agonizingly standing over a roaring, dangerously hot grill, completely engulfing himself in thick, suffocating smoke, simply to ensure that every single member receives the absolute perfect, tender cut of meat before he even considers taking a single small bite for his own exhausted, heavily drained body. When Yoongi cooks for his fiercely adored, heavily protected chosen family, he completely and deliberately bypasses the highly chaotic, heavily performative theatrics of the kitchen, opting instead for a deeply grounded, fiercely practical, and highly methodical approach that beautifully and perfectly mirrors his overarching, deeply poetic philosophy on life itself. Cut out all the unnecessary, distracting noise, focus fiercely and intensely on the absolute, undeniable core substance, and strictly let the undeniable, tangible results speak their own powerful, deafening volumes. The incredibly beautiful, profoundly emotional reality of Yoongi's absolute culinary mastery is that it serves as an incredibly rare, deeply vulnerable, and entirely unfiltered window directly into the incredibly soft, heavily guarded heart of a man who passionately, fiercely believes that true, unconditional love is fundamentally an action verb, not a loudly spoken noun, perfectly demonstrating that the ultimate, purest form of profound affection is quietly, consistently making sure the people you deeply cherish are physically healthy, intensely satisfied, and profoundly comforted by the warm, deeply nostalgic taste of a meticulously prepared, home-cooked meal. Watching him calmly, patiently instruct a highly eager but terribly clumsy younger member like Jimin or Taeyoung on the proper, safe way to hold a sharp knife, gently but firmly guiding their nervous hands with a soft, deeply endearing, gummy smile completely illuminating his beautiful face, profoundly shatters the incredibly stubborn, cold-hearted myth, brilliantly exposing him as the group's fiercely reliable, intensely nurturing caregiver figure who quietly and happily derives his absolute, deepest joy from the simple, highly profound act of providing immense physical sustenance. Behind the heavily guarded, fiercely independent exterior, the millions of heavily streamed records and the ferociously raw, deeply agonizing lyrics that have profoundly healed millions of deeply hurting souls across the massive globe, Min Yoongi is ultimately a profoundly grounded, incredibly giving, and fiercely loyal man from Daegu who silently, passionately knows that a perfectly cooked, fiercely comforting plate of food holds vastly more profound emotional resonance, incredible healing power, and unspoken, deeply rooted affection than 1,000 heavily rehearsed, perfectly eloquent speeches. His breathtakingly competent, profoundly moving, and entirely silent kitchen endeavors vividly and powerfully teach all of us an absolutely crucial, life-altering lesson in profound empathy and deep, unspoken love. You absolutely do not need to be the loudest, most dramatic person in the entire room to fiercely and powerfully demonstrate your care for others, and that quietly, consistently, and masterfully serving a beautifully prepared, intensely comforting meal to your highly exhausted, fiercely beloved friends is an incredibly profound, deeply impactful love language that echoes violently and beautifully through the silence.
Number 1. Jin.
the original dorm chef, master of the grand feast, pure, unconditional love served on a silver platter. When you finally reach the absolute, breathtaking pinnacle of this deeply emotional, profoundly heartwarming, and entirely unforgettable culinary countdown, it is entirely, undeniably impossible to think of absolutely anyone else to brilliantly occupy the undisputed, highly coveted, and deeply respected #1 spot other than the phenomenally handsome, breathtakingly charismatic, and deeply beloved eldest brother of BTS, Kim Seok-jin, universally adored across the entire globe as the incredibly charming, worldwide handsome, who not only beautifully anchored the entire wildly chaotic and unprecedentedly successful group with his famously broad, incredibly reliable shoulders, but literally, physically nourished their rapidly growing, intensely exhausted bodies and fiercely, relentlessly protected their heavily burdened, incredibly vulnerable souls during the absolute darkest, most terrifyingly uncertain and grueling periods of their history-making career. Have you ever truly, deeply stopped to intensely imagine the immense, crushing, and entirely suffocating weight of absolute responsibility that suddenly, violently crashes down upon a young, deeply privileged, and entirely naive college student who is abruptly thrust into a cramped, aggressively suffocating, heavily impoverished, and deeply chaotic soul dormitory, completely surrounded by 6 completely exhausted, incredibly hungry, fiercely ambitious, and deeply terrified teenagers who desperately miss the warm, deeply comforting, and incredibly nostalgic taste of their own mother's home cooking? Long before the blinding, deafening stadium spotlights, the tens of millions of heavily streamed, chart-topping records, and the astronomical, history-breaking, and entirely unprecedented global wealth, Jin was the absolute original, fiercely dedicated, entirely unsung, and profoundly essential culinary hero of the highly chaotic BTS household, a deeply nurturing, heavily reliable, and intensely maternal figure who instinctively, without a single fleeting moment of selfish hesitation, completely took on the incredibly demanding, highly unglamorous, and physically exhausting role of the group's primary, undisputed caregiver, beautifully and profoundly proving that his absolute, undeniably deepest love language is seamlessly, beautifully, and intensely woven into the very fabric of the massive, hearty, and heavily spiced meals he meticulously prepared for his incredibly precious chosen brothers. Let us take a profoundly emotional, incredibly tear-jerking, and deeply nostalgic journey back to those gruelingly difficult, famously broke, and highly desperate rookie days, a deeply emotional time when Jin, fiercely recognizing the heartbreaking, deeply painful reality that the group's struggling entertainment agency was heavily underfunded and practically entirely out of a basic food budget, would secretly, lovingly, and fiercely sneak expensive, highly coveted, and deeply nutritious ingredients from his own wealthy parents' home in Gwacheon, heavily utilizing his own incredibly meager, heavily guarded personal allowance to immediately buy massive, heavily discounted bulk quantities of simple chicken breast and basic fundamental vegetables, strictly and passionately to ensure that absolutely not a single one of his heavily exhausted, fiercely practicing younger members ever had to deeply experience the deep, biting, and entirely devastating ache of going to bed with an empty, wildly rumbling stomach. Do you vividly, fondly, and deeply remember the incredibly touching, widely celebrated, and profoundly legendary stories of Jin waking up completely exhausted, his entire body aching from relentless choreography practice at the absolute crack of dawn, long before the morning sun had even fully risen over the sprawling, heavily bustling Seoul skyline, meticulously, lovingly, and intensely preparing massive, deeply comforting
bowls of highly traditional Korean Tukook, rich rice cake soup, specifically and beautifully to warmly celebrate Namjoon's crucial birthday, or carefully, beautifully, and fiercely packing perfectly proportioned, deeply nutritious, and heavily decorated lunchboxes for a highly nervous, deeply anxious, and incredibly wide-eyed teenage Jungkook when the young prodigy was terrifyingly taking his crucial, highly stressful high school entrance exams. Have you ever closely, deeply witnessed the profound, unadulterated, and entirely blinding joy that instantly, brilliantly illuminates his flawlessly handsome, incredibly expressive face when he vigorously, passionately, and fiercely hosts his wildly iconic, heavily internet-breaking Eat Jin live broadcast sessions, fiercely, loudly, and heavily rejecting the incredibly toxic, dangerously restrictive, and entirely suffocating dietary norms of the fiercely competitive, heavily scrutinized K-pop industry by enthusiastically, happily, and deeply stuffing his incredibly soft cheeks with massive, mouth-watering bites of rich premium steak or wildly spicy, intensely red noodles, desperately, beautifully, and passionately trying to deeply instill a heavily healthy, intensely positive, and profoundly joyful relationship with food in both his highly beloved, fiercely protected members and his tens of millions of fiercely dedicated, deeply observing fans across the massive, entirely captivated globe. His incredible, highly distinct cooking style is completely, undeniably grand, heavily characterized by massive, terrifyingly huge, and entirely overwhelming portions that could easily, comfortably, and heavily feed a small, fiercely armed military battalion, vigorously, powerfully tossing incredibly heavy, massive, and dangerously hot woks with a breathtaking, awe-inspiring, and deeply intimidating physical strength that perfectly, beautifully, and intensely contrast his incredibly soft, heavily romantic, deeply elegant, and fiercely soaring vocal tone, whether he is fiercely, enthusiastically, and loudly battling completely uncooperative, highly confusing ingredients in an incredibly chaotic, heavily competitive run BTS cooking kitchen challenge, or proudly, confidently, and deeply passionately preparing a magnificent, heavily spiced, and incredibly complex seafood feast directly alongside his deeply respected, highly acclaimed, and world-renowned celebrity chef mentors like the legendary Lee Yun-bak. But the absolute, profoundly beautiful, and entirely undeniable core of Jin's massive, incredibly impactful culinary journey entirely lies not just in the sheer, staggering, and deeply overwhelming volume of the deeply delicious, highly comforting food he consistently, relentlessly produces, but in the incredibly pure, entirely unselfish, profoundly beautiful, and deeply moving intention heavily layered behind absolutely every single meticulously chopped, beautifully diced vegetable and perfectly, heavily seasoned, deeply fragrant broth, completely, fiercely bypassing the strict, incredibly intimidating, entirely pretentious, and heavily rigid rules of modern haute cuisine to strictly, passionately, and fiercely deliver profound, deeply needed emotional comfort, intense physical healing, and absolute, undeniable domestic, heavily grounded stability to a highly chaotic, wildly unpredictable, and intensely stressed group of absolute global superstars who essentially entirely grew up deeply, heavily relying on his incredibly warm, deeply reliable, and profoundly comforting presence. Can you even begin to fathom the sheer, profound depth of unspoken, intensely beautiful, and entirely selfless love it heavily requires for an incredibly exhausted, heavily burdened, and fiercely scrutinized megastar to continuously, relentlessly, and intensely prioritize the absolute physical well-being and deep emotional satisfaction of his deeply cherished friends, completely above his own desperate, physically aching need for highly coveted sleep, actively, happily, and fiercely choosing to vigorously stir a massive, aggressively boiling pot of deeply fragrant, intensely spicy stew, purely because he profoundly knows